Welcome back to Whisky Wednesday. Thank you for joining me. And I've got to say, thank you, really thank you, because I'm being quarantined just like all of you, and every week I'm really looking forward to being with you. I want to hear your comments. I want to get questions from you. You're watching Facebook Live or you're on spiritsnetwork.com, and you're going to have a good time. I guarantee you those whiskeys are really good. Hopefully you were able to purchase them ahead of time and you're going to be sipping along. If not, remember to do this next week. It's very important, just because there are delays right now in getting your bottles from your regular services. So, the reason why I'm very excited is because we're talking about peat. Peat, smoke, and the lack thereof. Now, quite a few of you are already single malt Scotch whiskey savvy, and you're looking at this lineup, and you're like, what? That first one, that Singleton of Glendullan, 18-year-old, is not any smoky. No, it's not. But I'll tell you why it's here. Remember, the title of this episode, our third virtual live tasting, Whisky Wednesday, is Peat, Smoke, and the Lack Thereof. What I want you to do right now is pour yourself a healthy dose of a smoky whiskey. And I want you to close your eyes. Where is that taking you? Try to picture yourself where the malt naturally will be putting you. To me, it evokes a sweet memory. To me, it's really cool because, well, you know, let's be a little intimate here. This places me right back to my first time. We were just caught in this terrible rainfall in the harshest of winters, and finding refuge right there by the fireplace. Oh God, even better, the next day, when putting my clothes back on, having those wonderful aromas of the fireplace. Well, it was cool. Good times. So, put it back. Don't drink it yet. It was just for the smell of it, okay? Now you gotta be patient. I want you to stay with me for quite some time, so that we finally get to it. And by the way, it's a benchmark. You should already have a few bottles of that at home. Hopefully you drink this on a regular basis. Peat is polarizing because I've got that sweet memory of it. You may too, but let's be honest. You've tried to introduce your friends or family members to peated Scotch whiskey, and they didn't like it. And they're like, oh, I don't like Scotch whiskey. Like it covers the whole Scotch whiskey. Not at all. First of all, peated Scotch whiskies are not the norm. And two, well, you don't have to drink it. There are so many other flavor profiles out there. But peat is very polarizing in the sense that it may be taking you to maybe off memories, right? It could be that hospital smell, because some people associate these smells with the antiseptic, the Band-Aid, right? Well, guess what? Some of those molecules are used in those very disinfectants. To me, it's all positive. It's my Madeleine de Proust, if I may. It takes me back to a wonderful world. So, peat or no peat? I thought maybe we'd start with something that's not peated. Why? Because modern single malt Scotch whiskey is not peated. Yet you can tell me that peat is what brings the accent to the Scotch whiskey landscape. Yes. This Singleton 18 represents what most of the single malt Scotch whiskey world has moved into in the 1960s or 70s. It's a no-smoke Scotch whiskey world. And that 18-year-old Remember, while I'm smelling it, since I have the Facebook app, please send me your comments and your questions. I'll be looking at that in a couple minutes. And I know, God, I love this. You see, to me, this is super exotic. I know it won a few awards, including a double gold recently. And peaches, dried apricots, almond paste. Here's the beautiful lack thereof. Okay? This is why it's important. When I drink Scotch whiskey, when I receive this call for single malt Scotch whiskey, more often than not, I don't want to go for anything smoky, right? I have my special circumstances, moments, moods, days, situations for a peated Scotch whiskey, right? And it's very silky, pretty long. This is a really good singleton. That's the 18-year-old expression. A non-peaty Scotch whiskey is the norm. But how did it get to be like this? Back in the day, remember that peat is what makes up the soil that you walk on when you're in Scotland, when you're in most parts of Ireland, when you're in parts of Russia, when you're upstate New York, when you're in Canada. It's about 3% of the terrestrial surface of the earth made of peatlands. And by the way, we're still discovering peatlands in exotic countries. But that's for another subject. Another time maybe. Remember, on Whisky Wednesdays, I want to hear your comments. I want you to be with me. You're totally bored. I know you've watched everything Hulu has to offer, everything Netflix has to offer. Hopefully you've been watching our great programming on Spirits Network, whether on your large screen, on your smart TV, or on your mobile app. Wherever you're watching it, I can tell you my favorite show is The Science of Spirits. Because I'm in it. No, I mean, really. We really try to give you great programming, and we need your feedback. Back to the whiskey. The reason why most whiskeys right now in Scotland are not smoky is because, well, there are more modern ways of drying your malted barley. Let me backtrack just a bit. In the Scotch whiskey production, there is that single malt Scotch whiskey category that calls for 100% malted barley. Okay, you malt the barley, and then in order to stabilize the barley, because maybe you're not going to be using this for distillation anytime soon, maybe you need to keep it just as is for a few weeks or a few months. You want to dry that malted barley. Back in the day, distilleries would be using, well, whatever fuel source. Could be wood, but when wood was not around, they would be using peat. And peat provides this natural heat, okay? It's quite simple. When peat was sort of outdated, when coal became the norm, nowadays it's natural gas, we've been getting non-smoky whiskeys because you've got that malted barley. You smoked it in the kiln, right? You're drying that barley over smoldering peat. You take those logs, you set them on fire, but you don't really want the flames, you just want the smoke. Peat is that soil. It takes about 1,000 years to make for a foot of peat. So when you're drinking, remember, wait a minute, we're not there yet. I'll come after you if you don't stay with me during this tasting. I'll take a question in a minute. When you're smoking that, when you're smoking, no, you're not smoking the whiskey, you're smelling the whiskey. When you're smelling that whiskey, that might be 16 years of age, we'll get there in a few minutes, it's not just 16 years of maturation. It's those thousands of years. Maybe it's a 4,000-year-old peat that they used to dry the malted barley. Not decomposed, but decayed vegetal matter. Mosses, heather, trees. On Isla, there were a lot of trees a few thousand years ago, right? Where the peat is harvested, where they dig the peat, whether it's on the very northern islands of Scotland, or on Isla, or on Jura, or is it in the mainland, different parts of the highlands of Scotland, you'll have a different composition because maybe you've got more heather here, you've got more moss there, you've got seaweed in that composition of the peat, right? Mostly you'll be in the presence of phenolic compounds. What we call phenolic compounds are the phenols, the cresols, the guayacols. This is what's in your smoke, right? So whatever you're drying over this smoldering peat, that peat reek is that smoke that's getting into the malted barley, you'll be getting those phenols. Once you've dried that malted barley, and maybe you've used that peat smoke, that peat reek for 5 minutes only, maybe you've used it for 6 hours, maybe the malted barley was really, really moist, 40 to 46% moisture content, so that it would really absorb that smoky character. Remember that time by the fireplace where you were not with me, but I can tell you, the cloth being wet, it absorbed all that fireplace aromas, all that wood burning, that smoke got into my clothes. That's exactly what happens in the kiln when they're drying the malted barley. So that barley will stay with this phenolic composition until, say, 16 years later, you drink it. It's very important because from a distillery to another, how long you're using that peat in the kiln and where the peat itself came from will make the flavor profile of your whiskey, right? And this is what will make it different from the next door distillery, right? So with this Glendullan Singleton 18-year-old, there's none of this. Time to get to the smoky side of life, but first I'll take a couple of questions. Let's see. I've got Paul here. Do you really think there's a big difference between Islay peat and Highland peat? Well, look, thank you. That's a great question. First of all, do I? And look, it's a tough one because out of those 8 distilleries on Islay that are delighting us with the smoky whiskies, not all of them are consistently smoky, but there's not one flavor profile. And there are quite a few distilleries right now in the Highlands making at least one mark in the range that is peated. Is there a common denominator of that peat? Not really. Well, I'll tell you what happens. Most distilleries will be sourcing their malted barley already peated or not from the commercial maltsters. And those guys may not say where they're getting the peat from. Some will tell them. And definitely this was analyzed, and we know that such bog will give you a very different composition than another one. So clearly this peat itself is very different. More cresols here, more phenols there. It's not only what you're going to do with the peat at smoking, it's the peat itself, right? Think about it this way. You love spicy food. I mean, I don't eat spicy food every week, but when I do, it's super addicting. I can't stop. I absolutely adore it, right? When you get that call for spicy food, there's nothing that should stand in between you and the spicy food, right? See, I'm even getting, just the idea of not putting my hands on spicy food right now gets me a little bit stressed out. But there's spicy food and there's spicy food. You can go for your jambalaya or you can go for your vindaloo, right? I mean, those are two really different kind of heats, right? You like it spicy or you like it spicy. But it's not just the amount of heat there. It's the kind of heat. It's the kind of spice. Is it coming from chipotle pepper? Is it mustard? Is it ginger? Is it jalapeno? So you see, it's the same thing with peat. It's not how much peat there is there. Let me not lose track of my tasting here, because I know you're keeping your home tasting pretty strict, and we all need a frame, right? So let's have this number 2 Talisker Storm while I'm answering your question. Sorry, I'm being a little long about this question, but it's a very important one because, oh, this is rich. Sweet and rich. Woody as in exotic wood. And of course, my regular call right now, what I'm thinking of, oysters, as usual. Back to your question. I'll give it a second. It's all about not only the time of that smoldering peat in the kiln, how long you will be giving those phenolic compounds to the malted barley, but it's where the peat came from. That's the chipotle pepper or that's the ginger, right? So you've got to know those peat bogs, I guess. Well, let me take another question. Tony, that's amazing. Who knew? Helps appreciate the flavors of whiskey. Well, I mean, thank you. I hope it helps, because you see, to me, it's not just that sweet memory by the fireplace. It's the fact that it ties me back to Mother Nature. I love the fact that I can put some terroir element to my whiskey consumption. Let's see. Jason is asking, do you do this right after a peaty dram, or do you warm up with something lighter? I do warm up with something lighter. I mean, you know, I did open that LAGAVULIN 16 because I wanted you guys to close your eyes and picture yourself in a hopefully a cool environment. But definitely you want to try something light. There's always an order to a tasting. When you're going to have some peated scotch, keep it for the end. Right? It's very simple. Just like it's very difficult when you're having a lamb biryani to appreciate a very refined Chambol Musigny, that Pinot Noir from Burgundy, right? It's very difficult. But you may still be able to appreciate, a great Zinfandel from California, because it can stand up for that heat of that spice, okay? Definitely there's an order. You warm up with it first, then you finish with peated Scotch whiskey. Let's see. But let's see. Why Adam? That's a very good one. Adam is asking, why do I enjoy LAGAVULIN 16 but can't seem to get behind Lafrogue or Bourmont? Very simply because those are very different types of phenolic compounds. And it's not just which phenolics were in the peat itself or the vegetation there, right? It's what the distillery did to capture those elements. During the dry kilning, during the drying of the malted barley, you gave the barley a certain amount, a peating level that you gauge in parts per million of phenols, ppm. You start with a barley at maybe that the master sent over or the farm sent over to you, or you did it yourself, at say 45 ppm. In the end, the whiskey, after say 30 years of aging, may be at only 5 parts per million of phenols, because in between there is maturation, but there is also distillation. And at distillation, if you want to capture those elements, you need to know when you do that, right? Phenolic compounds are heavier than others. You need to make sure that you capture them in the later part of the heart of the spirit run, right? But to go back to your question, to be more exact, it's a question of more phenols or more cresols or more guaicals and everything else, and the vanilla that you get and this and that from the barrels. And it's also whether there is more of the ex-bourbon barrel or virgin oak or sherry butts on a third fill and so on. So the shape of the still, the rate of distillation, and that very spirit cut will give you the answer. But I know that some of you will hate this brand and would absolutely love that other brand. Guess what? They're both at 45 parts per million of phenols to begin with on the barley. But anyway, let's move on. We've got Talisker to smell again and taste. And by the way, thanking all of you to bring me back for a bit of a spicy moment for those Whisky Wednesdays. I should say a special thank you for our members, our enthusiasts and our connoisseurs members, whom I have a lot of pleasure selecting bottles for every month. So remember, we love your comments, and hopefully we're doing a good job. Let's see, Talisker Storm. I told you back in the day, it was what was around, right? You'd warm up the house with a couple of logs of peat. You would, well, nowadays we're using that for gardening purpose as well. But this was what everybody was doing. However, say, let's go to the early 19th century. People had a taste for smoky beverages already, and this is something that I want to share with you because very few people do know this. You know, tea was shipped over to, say, England and Scotland, already smoked, because when you were smoking things, and it's not just food, I mean, you know, humans have learned to extend the shelf life of their meats and fish by smoking them. Fine. It used to be the same thing with tea. So when the grocers were receiving their teas, they were already smoked. Those teas were already smoked. Naturally, everybody had a taste for smoked beverages. So that's why not only was it the go-to fuel source to dry the malted barley, but it was already an acquired taste, generally speaking, from smoked meats to tea that was smoked. There was a taste generally accepted for smoky stuff, right? And you see, I say smoke and I use peat. Let me tell you about both. Screams, bring me oysters, bring me oysters. Oily. This is one thing about peated Scotch whiskies. Generally speaking, they will add a great textural element to the whiskey itself, because remember I just told you a minute ago, you need to capture those oils, those phenolic compounds that are larger molecules, towards the end of that heart, that spirit run. And because they're bigger molecules, bigger molecular weight, they will participate in a much thicker, richer, silkier mouthfeel. Anyway, back to class. There's smoke and there's peat. Smoke can actually come from a variety of sources. Smoke can, of course, come from the peat. You're talking about the cresols and the guaicals, because the phenols will be more on the medicinal and maybe antiseptic side, right? So smoke can come from there, but smoke can also come from the barrel itself. It can also come from the barley being dried to an excess, right? But the barrel, if you say age the whiskey for too long, or based on the conditions, if those are harsh conditions, maybe there's a lot of interaction with the barrel that was charred for the longest time, or really heavily toasted, well, you'll get some of those guayacals right there, given to the whiskey by the wood. But peat, though, is a general term, because now you understand. Am I using the term peated, or am I using the term smoky? It's all good. But yes, there are some whiskeys that are more on the smoky barbecue side, and others that are more on the medicinal iodine seaweed side, right? Let's see. Should I take a couple of questions? Yes. And we've got Shannon. Yes, bring the oysters. I feel like the deliveries are going to be about oysters tonight. Yoni, Yoni, thank you for joining, Yoni. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Can you discuss the no age statement products coming out versus having age statement on the bottle? Yes, I mean, this is, even though it's not specific to a peated Scotch whiskey consumption, there are lots of whiskeys that come with no age. Back a few years ago, when Scotch whiskey, single malt Scotch whiskey, became way too popular, and now I'm not just talking about the United States of America, we're definitely talking about the number one market for the consumption of single malt Scotch here in the US. It's just that the rest of the world discovered it. And the rest of the world, with some purchasing power, could put their hands on those fine single malt Scotch whiskies that we were just about the only ones to get prior to this. So now we've got to share the bounty. That means that a lot of those single malt Scotch whiskey distilleries had to go back to their stocks and get creative. And they said, well, look, at the rate of current consumption, we're not going to have enough of that 18-year-old or that 15-year-old. So we need to put the foot on the brake pedal here. How can we do this? So they went to their warehouses and they smelled this and that, and they said, well, look, we've got those very individual flavor profiles in those few barrels. Instead of using them with the rest to create our regular 15-year-old, we'll be using some as maybe either small batches or NAS, no age statement, because they show something very different. Maybe they're younger, but they're really unique. Maybe we're mixing that very old but odd that we would otherwise not release as a 25-year-old with that full of energy young 8-year-old. And that's it. And you've got that NAS with a Gaelic word on it, or not, but Talisker Storm is one of those great examples, I believe. Thank you, Yoni, for this character. I do believe that those distillers had to get creative, and it was great for the whole production of single malt Scotch whiskey. Now, to the next bottle, the one that maybe you've all been waiting for. You see, I'm building up some suspense here in those Whisky Wednesdays. And we're flying to Islay. Yes, I call it Islay. Islay. But you say it Islay. I was devastated. We were talking about shows on Netflix and Hulu and all of these platforms earlier. One of my very favorite shows, aside from Game of Thrones, now, yes, I got there, was Blacklist. Still is Blacklist. But then all of a sudden, James Spader is talking about this whiskey from Islay. And I'm like, I died inside. No, it's not Islay, it's Islay. Anyway, you're there, you're on Islay, you're safe. Amazing people. Super good oysters, by the way. And smoky whiskeys currently are enjoying a big time renaissance that LAGAVULIN 16 is almost solely responsible for. It paved the way for this smoky whiskey renaissance. Because, well, it's always been like this. And it's rich and gentle at the same time. Clove. It's a lot of iodine there. I know there are some sherry butts on the maturation, but it's a lot of ex-bourbon barrels as well. If you like smoky whiskeys, peaty Scotch whiskeys, we call you peat heads, peat freaks, you can't get enough of it. A few minutes ago I mentioned a 45 parts per million of phenols, right? It's kind of the average of medium peated whiskeys. Okay. A non-peaty whiskey, such as this Singleton 18-year-old, which, by the way, we can assume was peated at some time. Yes, of course, before this modernization of those Scotch whiskey distilleries that I was telling you about earlier, because all of them were sort of smoky. Well, before all of this, they were not thinking, am I getting more crystals? Am I getting more guayacols in there? No, they were just liking less peat or more peat, right? Right now, I know there are some bottlings that go all the way up to 300 parts per million of phenols, right? But a non-peaty whiskey, such as this Singleton 18-year-old, would be at 1 to 2 parts per million of phenols. Now, why not zero? Not zero, very simply because those same malting companies will provide the peated barley just like they would provide the unpeated barley. And what they do is they run batches of peated and batches of non-peated, but there are always some remnants of phenolic compounds here and there. So they cannot guarantee the distiller that there will be a 0 parts per million of phenols. But you can tell when there is smoke, right? And what do we say when there's smoke? There's fire, yeah. So there was a fire eventually because you're not getting anything smoky if you did not bring heat to the peat. In other words, that very romantic notion of that dark stream water that they would be using in the distillery that would bring a smoky flavor to the whiskey. No, absolutely not. Now, this whiskey is made from malted barley, and they used water for the malting. They used water for the reduction and for the condensation and all of this, right? But this water just running through that peat bog, brownish, will certainly not give any flavor of peat to the whiskey. Let's be clear about this very simply because it did not bring any heat, right? Do you have questions, comments? I hope you're following the class. Let's take a look. Mark has a good question. How would I know how to pair oysters with smoky whiskeys besides you telling us? Well, but remember, I'm here every Wednesday, Whisky Wednesday, that's it. Is there a good source for food and whiskey pairings? Funny you mention, there is an amazing book. There's this lady who is a spirits writer and journalist. She happens to be French, and she lives on Islay. She just fell in love with peated whiskeys many years ago, and she just decided to go live by the source of peated Scotch whiskey. And maybe because she's French, maybe because she's an amazing cook, she was at the very beginning of this, let's have food with our whiskey. But which food? Now, there are rules, right? And we can do an entire episode on this because it's a subject I'm really, really passionate about. Buy her book. It's in English. Her name is Martine Nouet, and her book is À table. Just simply À table. And remember, you can always send us an email at curationteam@spiritsnetwork.com. If you don't remember this, you'll get that book reference from me. So, what do we say? Boy, it's nice. Kyle has a good question. Would wearing a flannel shirt or growing a beard help me enjoy it more? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you think it will, it will. Kyle, let's stick to those three for now. Let's see. Antonio, LAGAVULIN 16 is the best to me. I gotta tell you. Oh, wait a minute. I gotta take another one. Sean has a good one. If smoke can come from a charred barrel, why isn't it present in old Scotch? Very simply because it's a charred barrel that might have been charred to an excess. Think 2-3 minutes. That's a super heavy char. But that barrel may have been aging that whiskey in specific conditions of great heat, dry environment, and great temperature variations, right? So that's why, generally speaking, single malt Scotch whiskey does not give you smoky notes outside of the smoky notes that they get from the phenolic compounds of the peat, because they're using ex-bourbon barrels, and very often on a second fill or third fill or rejuvenated barrel. So, you know, those very guayacals have been given to maybe the bourbons before, or the first fill Scotch whiskey, right? But what was I saying? Well, I can tell you that LAGAVULIN 16 is my go-to when I go to a steakhouse. Sometimes you don't really know why do you crave this and not that, right? I mean, why is it all sunny and nice and the temperatures are high and all that, and yet you feel like having some really rich stew, which you would normally associate with cold wintertime dinners? I don't know. When I have in mind to go to a steakhouse, I know already what I'm going to drink. And it's not like pairing with the steak for me. I know it does it very well for other people, but it's like right before I'm getting my steak, I need LAGAVULIN 16. Just like I need Talisker for my oysters. It's just, it's almost like it's a Pavlovian thing to me, you know. It calls for a steak. That's how it is. What will be my next bottle? What will be my selection of next month's bottle for your membership, if you're an enthusiast or connoisseur? Look, peatlands are extremely important, and maybe this is my climate change fighter speaking right now, but even though I told you those 3% of the terrestrial surface of the earth only are made of peatlands, those peat bogs are extremely important for Mother Earth. Very simply because they're a carbon trapping zone. They're carbon sequestering to the point where we absolutely need to preserve those peatlands. And I mean, I'm taking that tone of gravity here because it is super important. And maybe I like Lagavulin 16 even more because I know that the distillery is involved in the preservation and that initiative of preserving the peatlands. We've got to be careful with peatlands. It's the future of planet Earth. So I feel like I'm helping with it. Well, look, I hope you've been enjoying this tasting just like I did. Again, thank you for bringing me out of my quarantine misery. I absolutely love being with you. And remember to watch more of me on Spirits Network and to pre-order your bottles, please. It's definitely been quite a few delays. But eventually you get your bottles. You just need to get on right now with ordering next week's bottles. And again, if you have trouble sourcing them, maybe we can suggest something similar. Curation team at spiritsnetwork.com. Next week's bottles. Okay. On Whisky Wednesday at 6 p.m. next week, I will be crowning some of my favorites. Certainly my favorites in the very specific following categories of best Speyside. And yes, I'm a humble guy. I love Cragganmore 12-year-old. So that's it. Cragganmore 12. Best 15-year-old. This guy's younger sibling, the 15-year-old Singleton. So you've got Cragganmore 12, you've got Singleton 15, and then best young malt. To go back to your point, Yanni, age is no issue here. 8-year-old is young, yet to me, this Lagavulin 8-year-old, it does the trick. As usual, and as always, do not drink more. Drink responsibly. Drink better. Pay attention to what you've got in your glass. Go back to them. It's always a great exercise. I don't want to leave you guys. I know you've got stuff to do. Thanks again. Get your bottles. Get excited. I'm with you. We're all in this together. And certainly, I want to help. Prepare your questions. Prepare your comments. Thanks. And cheers. Slanjva. Drink responsibly.